Hey everyone, Rose here. I'm back from my vacation and I made another 3D model. I haven't had a whole lot of time to record this week, so I'm not going to be going in depth with the narration on this one. But I hope you guys can still get something out of it. If you want a more detailed explanation of all the things I'm doing, definitely check out some of my other videos where I explain stuff more. Anyway, on with a time-lapse. Like always when sculpting a 3D character, the first step is blocking. For that, I use two kinds of objects. For things like the body or the head that are pretty much round, I start from spheres and adjust the shape of them slightly in sculpt mode. And for things that are longer and thinner, like the limbs, I use a skin modifier setup. That's just a single vertex with a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier that I can extrude in edit mode to shape the limbs. Once all the very basic pieces are in place, I start shaping stuff out a bit more and adding a little bit more detail. For that, I usually go into sculpt mode, apply all the modifiers, and then use shift+r and ctrl+r to remesh. That way I can get a bit more resolution on the object and adjust the shape a bit more and just make sure all the proportions and stuff look correct. Early on, it's also really useful to keep your model as a bunch of separate objects, because that makes it a lot easier to scale stuff and move stuff around, and also work at different levels of detail for different pieces. Later on, when you're refining the shapes more, it's going to be useful to merge stuff together, but for now, keeping them separate is really useful. From my personal workflow, this part of the process is probably the most important, because I'm making sure all the proportions are right and all the overall shapes and stuff read the way I want them to. You can make a model really detailed and spend a whole lot of time adding in all the small bits and pieces, but if the basic proportions are off, then the whole model is going to look off. And the further you get along in the process and the higher resolution you are, the harder it's going to get to adjust all the basic shapes. So definitely spend enough time early on making sure everything looks right and everything is in place. And now the blocking is done, and it's time to add in a bit more detail. I could do this part in Blender, but I got Zbrush recently, and it works a little bit better for sculpting. The next step of the process is refining and defining all the shapes and adding in a bit more detail. One of the things I do here is really make sure all the planes of the face look correct, so I go around with a sort of crease brush and really define all the important plane changes and everything. I'm gonna smooth all that out later, but sculpting it in the first place gives you a kind of good base to work off of and just make sure all the shapes look the way they should. I continue the same process with all the parts of the body, occasionally using Dynamesh to give myself a bit more resolution, and sometimes even using the remesher when I want to smooth stuff out a bit more and just give it a bit cleaner topology. I also start going around and merging together all the separate objects I had made to slowly build up the overall form and make sure everything has a consistent level of detail. Now that I have all the pieces in place and merged together, I smooth out the whole surface a little bit and then go around adding in a whole bunch of polygroups. I'm gonna be using these as a sort of guide for the Z-remesher, so I can get one final really smooth Z-remesh pass and then go in and sculpt in all the remaining details using subdivisions rather than Dynamesh. The polygroups here are pretty much arranged the way you would arrange your edge loops for Retopology, but this isn't gonna replace a final Retopology just because an automatic remesher just isn't like smart enough to do a proper Retopology for a character. There is some distribution of like detail and edge flow and stuff like that that it's just not going to figure out unless you spend a huge amount of time doing a whole bunch of pre-planning and drawing out guides and stuff like that, and at that point you might as well just manually retopologize. Once all the polygroups are in place, I Z-remesh, making sure to select keep polygroups, and then I reproject all the detail, and then I forgot to record when I sculpted in the remaining bits of fur, but there wasn't really anything special about that process, so don't worry about it. There are some parts of the model that I don't sculpt using my regular workflow of like blocking then sculpting. The teeth and the tongue are one example of that. I pretty much just box model most of the detail in and then do just a little bit of sculpting at the end to add in the final bits of detail. At this point, the sculpt is pretty much done. The only thing left to do is add a little bit more detail here and there and break up the symmetry a little bit. In this case, I'm adding a few extra like chunks or strands of fur all around the place to just make him look a bit more fluffy. This part of the sculpt can actually be deceptively hard because you have to find a balance between making the model look fluffy, but also not having too much unnecessary noise. And with that, the sculpt is complete, and it's time to head back to Blender for Retopology. The first thing I do is decimate the model quite a bit. If the model has a too high resolution, the whole process just ends up being super slow and annoying. Then I open up Retopoflow and start working on the Retopology itself. In my experience, Retopology is a little bit faster and smoother when you're using Retopoflow, but it's also quite an expensive add-on, and it's not entirely necessary. You can pretty much do all the things you can do with it in vanilla Blender, it just takes a bit longer. When retopologizing, I generally start with the face because that's the part of the model that has the most specific requirements in terms of edge loops, and it's the most complicated. I just like getting that done to begin with, and then I can just kind of chill out with the rest of the process. While retopologizing, the first and most important thing to figure out is where your edge loops are gonna be. You want to have your edges sort of flowing in the direction where you want things to move, and very often also outlining important features like the eyes and the mouth. Especially when you're starting out, it's really useful to go online and look up like face topology and stuff like that to get an idea of how your main edge loops should look. And once you have those down, you can then go around filling in the spaces in between them and adding in more and more resolution. A lot of videos about retopology will tell you to stick to only quads for absolutely everything. In my experience, that's not entirely true. Your model can deform fine with a few triangles here and there, and sometimes even a couple of n-gons. It's just important to be careful where you place them. For example, it can be useful to have them in a couple of places where you just want one edge loop to end, or in parts of the model where stuff just isn't deforming much. It can be worth just adding in a triangle rather than having to add in a whole bunch of extra geometry just to fit in some quads. It could actually be very useful to try out a little bit of rigging just to see how stuff deforms, so you can get a better understanding of how your topology is going to influence animation and rigging later on, and what you can do to make it better and nicer, I guess. When you're retopologizing, make sure to keep in mind what the model is supposed to be used for and what requirements it has based on that. For example, this model is going to be a game asset, and most of the details are going to be baked in using normal maps. So the important thing here is that I capture the entirety of the silhouette in the geometry itself, but I keep the resolution relatively low so that everything is properly optimized when it's used in a game engine. But for example, you might be making a model that's going to be used in something like film animation, where it's going to be subdivided, or you might want to 3D print your model after posing it, and for those you want to take your resolution quite a bit higher and make sure really all your details are captured in the geometry itself. Once you're happy with the topology of the head, it's time to move along down the neck and start working on the body. I may or may not have forgotten to press record for a couple of minutes and skipped over the part where I retopologized most of the body. This part of the process really didn't take long though, it was just like 10 to 20 minutes or something like that, and it's pretty much just taking super basic circular edge loops around most of the body. Like for example, the arms and the legs, you can just wrap pretty much a cylinder around them and add a few extra edge loops. And even for the body, you can just take your loops and edges that you already have and just pull them down along the length of the body and just slightly adjust them to fit the curvature. One thing that tends to be a little bit challenging though is the shoulder. because you're intersecting a whole bunch of things. You're intersecting the neck with the arms and the torso, and it's a really important part of the mesh, so it deserves a little bit of extra attention to make sure that it deforms properly later in animation. Other than that, the body doesn't tend to need nearly as high resolution as the face, because it's usually not quite as detailed, and it doesn't have to make the same kind of really small detailed movements. Last but not least, the hand needs to be retopologized. This is, along with the face, one of the most difficult parts of the body to retopologize in my opinion, because again, there's so many different edge loops and so many different pieces intersecting, and it also needs to move a lot and has quite detailed animation very often. I personally prefer to start by retopologizing all the fingers because they have relatively simple cylindrical topology, but they sort of inform all the edge loops that have to be connected up for the rest of the hand. Once I have them done, I add a few faces between them to connect them, and then I drag down the whole edge and start working on reducing the amount of edge loops, usually by adding in a few diamonds, and then connecting everything up and adding the thumb and just trying to finagle everything around so that it connects to the wrist in some kind of a decent way, hopefully without topology and edge loops that just go all over the place without any rhyme or reason. Though very often that's a bit hard to avoid with hands. The last thing left to do for the retopology is fill in the inside of the mouth. That tends to be a bit of a pain because using like shrink wrap, everything gets stuck to the wrong part of the model, but also like with Retopoflow it just goes completely mad because you're working on faces that aren't like clearly visible. So very often I just go into very basic edit mode and actually completely turn off shrink wrap and just kind of model something that a roundabout fits, and then turn on shrink wrap later and just hope it connects up halfway decent. The topology in there is luckily not particularly important because you rarely ever see it, since it's hidden away inside the mouth and you're still gonna have like teeth and tongue and everything kind of covering it up. With some final tweaks here and there, the main body mesh is fully retopologized. But I'm not quite done yet. I still need to address all the other bits and pieces that the model is made up of. For example, the eyes, brows, hair, teeth, etc. For some of them, I need to retopologize them the same way I did the body, but for others I can get away with just adding in a whole new mesh, like with the eyes. Or I can duplicate and decimate the original sculpted mesh and just tweak the topology a little bit. And retopology is done, and it's time to rig. Like with pretty much all of my character models, I start out with the Rigify base meta rig and just adjust that around to fit the shape and proportions of my character. I usually also have to add and remove some bones to match the needs of the character I'm making, but it's still usually a whole lot faster than having to manually add in all the bones. Especially since there are some specific naming conventions that bones need in order to make weight painting easier, and Rigify just has those by default, so you don't need to manually do all that annoying naming. While working on the rig, you might come across a couple of maybe parts of the model that need a few tweaks in terms of the geometry, so definitely keep a lookout for those and tweak them if needed. It's a lot easier to adjust the topology now, rather than when you've already UV mapped and baked a whole bunch of stuff. Once all the bones are in place, I make sure everything is properly symmetrical and the new bones I added have the correct names. And then I can start parenting all the mesh to the bones. One thing I don't do is generate the actual Rigify rig. You could do that, and in my opinion the Rigify rig is pretty good from what I've used it for, but for this character and for the needs of the commission, it's not really necessary, and it would just be a whole bunch of technical stuff to mess around with, which I don't really want to deal with. When I'm parenting my mesh to my armature, there are a couple of bones that shouldn't affect certain meshes, so when I'm parenting those meshes, I make sure that deform is toggled off on those bones. For example, the bones for the hair or the eyes shouldn't affect the body mesh at all. There are other bits of the model that should only be affected by one single bone, and in those cases, I just parent them with empty groups and then manually just add in the weight painting I want on the single group that should affect them. For example, I did that for all the claws. With all the meshes parented to the armature, it's time to go around and do some weight painting. Make sure to turn on auto normalize in the tool options, and under overlays, make sure show zero weights is turned on for the active group. From there, it's just a matter of going into weight paint mode, posing the model a bit, and adjusting your weights until the deformations look about right. With this kind of armature, you're never gonna get to like 100% perfect deformations because you would need a few extra like shape keys and corrective bones to make everything look perfect. But for what I need this model to do, this is gonna be fine. And now, with all the bones in place and the weights painted, the last thing left to do for this model is the materials. For that, I'm gonna need a UV map. For UV mapping, I work in a couple of steps. First thing I do is divide up the model into a whole bunch of different parts, separating out like the limbs from the torso and the head and everything like that. Then I add in some extra seams going down all the pieces to make sure I don't have any stretching. And I add in an additional texture, usually a UV grid, just to make sure that that stretching isn't there and to add any extra seams where they're needed to reduce it. Once everything looks around about good, I apply my mirror modifier, make sure to unwrap it again so that it unwraps without the mirror modifier. And then I just go around arranging all my UV islands on my texture space to make sure that they take up all the space efficiently, but are also arranged in a sort of reasonable way so that things that have a similar color all kind of go together. Once the UV map is done, I triangulate my low poly mesh and then explode everything out so that I have the high poly piece with the given low poly piece, so that I can export everything out into XNormal to bake it. I had a random issue where something kept crashing while I was exploding the model, so I lost a bit of footage. But if you look at some of my other videos where I did baking, it's the same process everywhere. In XNormal, I just import the high and low definition meshes that I just exported, then go around making sure that my export settings are all correct. I want to bake a normal, ambient occlusion, and cavity map for this one. And then I wait for the bake to finish. Finally, I import all the finished textures into Blender and plug them into a big shader. And I forgot to hit record again. Aside from the baked textures, I added in an additional image texture in Blender for the flat colors, and I plugged in both the ambient occlusion and the cavity map in as a sort of multiply layer on top of that to give the whole thing a bit of a livelier color with a bit more fun depth. From here, all that's left for me to do is paint in all the flat textures from the reference, and then bake everything down into one single image texture. And with a bit of nice lighting and a proper pose, here's the finished model. I'm quite happy with how this guy turned out. He's quite different from most of the other characters I've made. I don't make that many rounder, chubbier characters, and he turned out really cute. And the commissioner really likes him too, which is always great. Anyway, like I said, I just got back from my vacation, so I didn't have a whole lot of time to record a detailed narration for this video, but I hope you guys were able to get something out of it anyway. Next week, hopefully, I'll be back with something more in-depth and fun and interesting. Anyway, that's been all for me for today. I hope you guys have a nice day and see you all next time. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe check out one of my other videos to the right. If you'd like to see more of my art or maybe get a commission from me, I've put links to all that in the description below. And I've also put a link to the Discord server. Anyway, I hope you have a nice day and see you all next time.